shared a variety of different aspects about this over the last few weeks. We talked about in June about how we're engaged with our local community.
I'll speak really loudly.
You plan for jokes sometimes and people don't laugh at them, and then they laugh at the things that aren't meant to be laughed at. Last week we shared from Colossians chapter 3 about how each one of us is called and chosen by God to live lives which are really distinctly different and as such become incredibly attractive to people in our society. Later this term we're going to explore as we walk a little bit through the book of Jonah. But to begin with today, I want to take you with a journey exploring the world that we live in. If we're engaged in a mission to this world, we really should understand where we're coming from. You know, I have to say this year has been an interesting one at CHBC. In a very real way, it feels like over the past few years that we've walked untrodden paths. I've mentioned before that last year I was in a couple of sessions with a clinical psychologist with experience in trauma. This was not for personal stuff, this was about church communities. And he said that our expectation is that it should take 2 years as a recovery period because there was 2 years of kind of lockdowns. That was the kind of rule of thumb that they used in their area. That actually is still happening till the end of the year. Time in some ways goes quickly, but slowly, I find, in this particular point in time. But I've got to say that I'm really encouraged to see some green shoots of life around. During this past few months, we've spoken a little bit in the life of the church about the church's financial position. Phil gave us an update last week. Personally, I continue to see our finances, personal church finances, as primarily a faith issue for us. Will we trust in what God is calling us to do? How do we respond in that situation? And as Phil mentioned, over the past few months, we've gone very close to meeting our budget, which I find incredibly encouraging and on a good trajectory. I was away a couple of months ago with a couple of colleagues who lead similar sort of sized churches to this one, and they were sharing with me how their budgets are down, significantly down at the moment. And I find it encouraging that people are responding in a really positive way. I see some green shoots there. I've spoken a little bit about how for each one of us, if we want to have an active faith, if we want our faith to have a real sense of vitality in our life, we need to be engaged as participants, not as spectators. As participants, not spectators. And it really pleases me to see and hear stories, even over the past few weeks, about numbers of people putting their hands up to participate. And not only that, participating in the life, in a sense, internal life of the church, but actually participating in life outside the bounds of the church. I think that's really encouraging to see. We've spoken about how as a church community, one of the struggles for us as a church community for a long time is that we haven't seen significant numbers of people who from outside of church history come to faith in Jesus. And so when I was talking to Matt during the week and he was telling me about how, as he mentioned before, how Alpha was basically on the way to being filled, how exciting that was. He was telling me that there's some uni students coming who are friends of some of our younger people, some family members of another person, some neighbours of another person. And I don't know about you, but that warms my heart. And so I thought it was important for me to not only warm my heart, but to warm your heart as well. It's wonderful to see. Because we are, and don't mistake this by any way, don't minimise this in any way, we are people of good news. That's essentially what it means for the gospel of Jesus. We are people of good news, and we help people to find that good news in their life. It's an incredible privilege and an incredible opportunity. The struggle, though, I have to admit, is that at times in Australia in the 21st century, it feels like we're pushing a barrel up a hill. It feels like that people in the 21st century are more antagonistic towards the church than ever before. And I've got some news for you. It doesn't seem like it's immediately going to get better. And don't be mistaken. So what are we meant to do in this context? That's right. What are we meant to do, Martina? Are we meant to give in, throw in the proverbial towel? Should we just hope and pray for the coming of Jesus? Or should we be actively involved? But fortunately, I want to say to you today that amidst all what might seem doom and gloom and bad news, there is significant hope. So if you have a Bible with you, if you turn to the book of Acts, the books of the Bible get their names from various reasons. Some of them get them from the author of the book, like Matthew and Mark and Isaiah. Some of them get their names from the recipients of the book, like Romans and Hebrews and Philemon. And some of them get their names from the topic, like Genesis or Numbers or Psalms or Kings. Well, Acts is one of these. The full name, in a sense, is really the Acts of the Apostles. It describes the life of the early church. And I have to say it's super helpful in so many ways. In one way particular is because the world in which it was written to has some sort of connection to today. The church in the first century was small. It had no power. Many people had a false perception about what it stood for and even who Jesus was. And sometimes, today, it feels like we live in that world, a world that doesn't want to hear, that doesn't understand. So let's open to Acts chapter 17, and hopefully we'll discover some helpful advice for what it has to say. And in Acts 17 it says that Paul and Silas travelled through the towns of, a couple of Greek towns, and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row he used the scriptures to reason with the people. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. And he said, this Jesus I'm telling you about is the Messiah. We read about Paul on his journeys through the Western Mediterranean, arrives at what is a part of northern Greece, Thessalonica, and Paul's process of life and ministry was always to start in a synagogue. He was familiar with a synagogue because he would call himself a Pharisee. That was part of his heritage. He knew the language, knew the people. And somehow, as he goes to this new synagogue in Thessalonica, he finagles a gig, and 3 times on a Sabbath he stands up and speaks to people about who Jesus is. Paul is on home ground here. He's on home ground. He knows the mind of Jewish people. He knows the culture of Jewish people. And so he knows how to speak to them. So what does he do? Well, he focuses on Jesus, because that's the critical question for any Jewish person. Who is Jesus? Or even to go a little bit deeper, is Jesus the Messiah? So it tells us that he uses the Hebrew scriptures, something which was close to the heart of any Jewish person, to prove to them who Jesus is. See, Paul is like any wise communicator. He knows that he needs to listen and understand and then speak into the needs of people. But then we track along a little bit further in the chapter. And in verse 16 it says this, because Paul and his companions move on to a new city. While he was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. He went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. But then it also says, he spoke daily in the public square to all who happened to be there. Gone to the synagogue, but now he moves into the public square. And it tells us that in a sense he walks around, observes the art that's on display. He sees the idols that are a part of daily life in Athens. And goes on in verse 8, and it says he also had a debate with some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. When he told them about Jesus and his resurrection, they said, "What's this babbler trying to say with these strange ideas he's picked up?" Others said, "He seems to be preaching about some foreign gods." He begins to speak, to preach in Athens. Probably in that environment, it would be him speaking and then engaging in some debate, some Q&A. Sometimes I think that would be helpful in our conversation. Imagine having a free form of Q&A at the end of every time. But it tells us, it goes on in verse 19, they took him to the high council of the city. "Come and tell us about this new teaching," they said. "You were saying some rather strange things and we want to know what it's all about." And it's got kind of like little brackets. It was known about Athenians as well as the foreigners there that they like to spend their time discussing, because Athens as a centre of culture and learning was a place where ideas were debated. These events take place on quite a well-known physical spot. It's called Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. There's a picture of it on the screen. You can see it today. It was the meeting place for the highest court in Greece for civil and criminal and religious matters. It was an important place where philosophy and religion were discussed. And it tells us that Paul debated with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. The Epicureans were a philosophical school that valued pleasure. That's not a surprise, is it? We all kind of know what Epicureans are in this day and age. It says that they disbelieved in the gods of ancient myths. And they were kind of influential in the educated upper classes, because maybe that's what they wanted, the pleasure in the upper classes. They believed that God existed, but essentially that God was not really interested in humanity. Just kind of like started the ball rolling and then walked away. In contrast was Stoicism. Stoicism was the most popular form of Greek philosophy in its day. And most people, whether they were Stoics or not, had kind of Stoicism at the heart of their thinking. They believed in a supreme God, but that this God was everywhere. The fancy word for it is pantheistic. It means that God is in all things. The Stoics saw their world as determined by fate, and so a human must pursue their duty, live in harmony with nature and reason, and however painful it might be, just be self-sufficient and endure. The goal of life, in a sense, was to rise above these things. So you endured. These are very different beliefs than the Jewish audiences that he encountered in the synagogue. And so Paul seeks to understand the Athenian. He wants to know what are the touch points for them. What are the things that make a difference in their life? Who they were. And so in verse 22, Paul stands before the council. He says, "Men of Athens, I noticed that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking along, I saw your many shrines. One of your altars," and this is part, you can find the historical, archaeological things of this effect. One of them said this, "To an unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about." You see, Paul begins to engage in their world. He listens, he observes, he seeks to understand, and then he speaks to their need. Not to an unknown God, but to the God that he knows. You see, in verse 24 it says, "He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he's the Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples. Human hands can't serve his needs because God doesn't have any needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, satisfies every need." He goes on to say that his purpose was for nations to seek after God and perhaps find and feel their way towards him, though he's not far from anyone. In him we move and live and exist. And then he goes on to say that God has overlooked people's ignorance about him in the past, but now he's calling people to himself, calling them to repent of their sin. He critiques the Athenian God and introduces them to the God who is the creator and sustainer of all of life. He shows, in a sense, the futility of their own situation and shows them where purpose can be found. You see, Paul now speaks to them having listened and understood their needs about where they can find hope. You see, this is a very wise piece of lived out advice in his life. He tells us what? In every context that we live, it's important that we seek to know and understand people. And you know, when you go to your workplace, to your school, to your neighbourhood, For each of us who want to share good news and truth, we need to listen and understand. Speak in that context. This was the world that the Apostle Paul lived in. Now, how about the world that we live in? Australia was once described as a Christian nation. In the 1972 census, a mere 50 years ago, more than 90% of people identified as a Christian. In the most recent census of 2021, the numbers were out last year, it showed what? A significant decline. Not 90%, less than 44% would identify as Christian. And you don't have to be a rocket science to understand what the demographics of that might look like. Much higher in the mature ages, much lower in younger ages. And if this helps for you to understand, church attendance, defined in a sense as people who attend church at least once a month, less than 15% of people in that space, about 1 in 7. About 7% of Australians, it's estimated, are in a church on a Sunday. In our society, where there once was Christianity, what exists now? Leslie Newbigging, who's quite a famous English missionary and prolific author, once wrote this. He said, "No room remains empty for long. If God is driven out, the gods come trooping in. Where once there was something moved out, it doesn't remain empty. Nature abhors a vacuum. In come other gods." So I want to ask you a little question here, and I'm going to invite you, if you feel comfortable to do this, to turn to someone, right? And I'm going to give you just a minute or two, right? And I want you to think about and respond, maybe 1 or 2 different things, and ask this question, right? What is different in Australia of 2023 compared to Australia of 1973? Right? You can make your choice, right? You can make your choice about what that might be. Someone said to me the other day, well, the internet didn't exist. Yeah, okay, there's an easy one, right? What is different? Okay, think about, can be practical things, could be values or ethics. So I'm going to give you 1 minute. Turn around to someone who you feel comfortable with. And if you don't, well, it's a great opportunity to say hi to someone. Try to identify 1 or 2 things. If you're joining us online, you might want to put 1 or 2 things in the chat box. I was with a person the other day and they said, "How should I know, Andrew? I was born in 2000. I thought to myself, why am I even speaking to you, child? Well, I hope you're able to find a couple of things. I'm going to share with you just a few very simple ideas about changes that have happened in our society. And the first one, and probably the most obvious and significant one, is the rise of the individual. The rise of the individual. Sometimes we would call it expressive individualism, where an individual is free to express and pursue individual happiness, free to follow my own heart, to dress how I want, tats, piercings, no one or nothing should be opposed, anything goes. It should never be inhibited by government or religion. And as part of the rise of individualism, we've also seen what we would call a strong belief in moral autonomy. Moral autonomy is Kind of a fancy way of saying it's the capacity to deliberate and to give myself the moral law. I am the one who determines what is moral for myself. No one else, not the injunctions of others. How I see the world, how I perceive truth is my choice. It's not yours. You cannot impose your truth on me. I have control over my body. My body, my choice. The rise of moral autonomy. The second thing I want to just give you a little insight to is a change in the very nature of ethics and what we would now call therapeutic scales of ethics. Therapeutic scales of ethics. Essentially it is this, that right or wrong is determined on the basis of pleasure or pain. Right or wrong is determined on pleasure or pain. Pleasure is, you'll be surprised to hear this, good, and pain is bad. That's it. If it feels good and does not directly harm anyone else, it's good. If it hurts, then ending the pain is the priority. Right and wrong are not determined by God, not determined by duty, by virtue, by utilitarian, by consequences, by anything like that. Purely by right, by pleasure or pain. Now we get some insight into parts of Australia by looking at one of our Commonwealth colleagues, probably the country that in many ways Victoria I think relates to best, in Canada. Canada has recently, the same as Victoria, has implemented an assisted dying legislation. In Canada, it's called medically assisted in dying, MAID. It does make me laugh that they didn't just call it medically assisted dying. But anyway, they've done a recent survey there and they've said these conclusions from it. Half of Canadians, and you can see that this is very similar to Australia, half of Canadians would agree that to allow adults in Canada to seek medical assistance in dying due to an inability just to receive medical assistance. Nearly 3 in 10 would expand their guidelines. So this essentially is a reason for you to get legal assistance to die. Nearly 3 in 10 want to expand that guidelines to include homelessness, poverty, or disability. Because if it's painful, then that should determine what I do. The numbers are even higher the younger you go. Because our ethics are determined by if it feels good, it must be good. If it's bad, it feels bad. And not only that, these ideologies are held in our world, a world which is increasingly secular, but ironically held with religious fervour. So they are ideas for which people campaign and hold on strongly. In fact, we talk about people being cancelled and things like that in our world. These ideas are held with religious fervour. And so if you disagree with them, it's not a matter of debating an idea. It's a matter of you are discarded. So whether they are environmental, gender, sexuality, whatever it might be, they are held with religious fervour. The third thing that I want to mention briefly to you is the massive change in the negative attitude towards religion. It comes from, I suppose, a couple of different perspectives, doesn't it? The first thing we might say is that there are internal issues, institutional failure and pastoral leadership failure. The crisis of credibility. You think about how the church has hit all the big issues over the last 50 years. Sex, people think the number one, in fact in Australia, the number one inhibitor to people understanding, in a sense, who Jesus is the Royal Commission Against Child Abuse. Number one. 75% in surveys, more than 75% of people identify it as a problem. But it's not just child abuse, is it? We've also seen sexual promiscuity amongst Christian leaders. We've seen it with money, discussed about the exploitation of money. And now we've even seen it with power, exploiting women and also exercising power in dodgy type behaviour. I've watched 3 Hillsong documentaries over the past 18 months, none of them greatly encouraging. And this has led to an environment which not only has a negative attitude towards religion, but essentially expresses this idea that religion at its best is okay to express in private, but harmful in public. The fourth one that I just want to throw in there, almost like a little bit of a curveball for you, is this: that there is no homogenous Western society anymore. There are subcultures all a part of our world. And so when I was a teenager, the top 40 of music was the top 40 of music. Now music has so many different subcultures. In a sense, there's very, very little stuff that actually goes across all of society. And so we all operate in our little local perspectives. This is the society that we are a part of. As Paul sought to understand his world, so must we seek to understand our world. But as we look at that world, do we see anything beyond despair? Is it all just doom and gloom? I mean, like as I mentioned before, changing values make Christianity seem like an anathema today. More than half of Australians, when they are surveyed, describe themselves as having very strong reservations or are passionately opposed to Christianity. More than half, about 51, 52%. But the problem is in the midst of this, our nation is in pain and crisis, isn't it? It's filled with despair. The environment, the economy, sense of justice, wars, relationships, politics. You can take any variety of survey and discover the number of people that are filled with mental health issues, whether it be amongst young women, whether it be amongst young people. The numbers of people who are contemplating suicide have more than trebled over the past 30 years. I read one report recently which identified how communities are incredibly lonely. In 2021, 26% of all households consisted of one person. Many people dislocated from family and relationships. 20% of people, 1 in 5, report they have 0 friends. 1 in 5, 0 friends. Nearly 50%, less than 3. So where, in the midst of this time where everything seems so bleak, where there is no relationships, where there is mental health issues, people don't trust institutions, it's part of the issues with the church. No one trusts banks, governments, health systems, education. In Australia, the irony, a place where we seem to have everything and yet nothing, more wealth, more time increasingly than ever before, and yet a void that's never filled. You see, the good news is in the midst of this crisis is that we believe, don't we, that we can actually find in Jesus true hope and meaning and love. And so as much in a sense as the church is on the nose, here is this great opportunity for where in Jesus we can find the needs that are important for all of life. Look at what Jesus did in the midst of his world. See how it might encourage us. He's the one who sat beside a Samaritan woman who had been shunned by her community, who was filled with guilt, and yet he offers her living water. He rubs shoulders with a tax collector who was a pariah, who had stolen from his people. He invites him into his house. And this guy, his life is transformed, and so instead of stealing, he becomes generous and giving. Welcomes a prostitute, forgives her for her sin and introduces her to a new life. This is the Jesus who observed, who sat with and listened and understood, and yet managed to give hope and meaning and love. You see, as I've not only been personally reflecting over this topic, but doing a whole lot of research and stuff, again, thinking of how we are on mission in Maroondah, one of the great ironies that I've found is this, is that the vast majority of people say that they oppose Christianity. But the vast majority of people say that the Christians that they know, they love. It's this strange dichotomy. I oppose the institution But you know Mary? Oh, she's fantastic. You know Bill? Oh, look, I'm so glad to have him as a neighbour, my work colleague. The institutional behemoth is disliked, but the majority of Christians are personally seen in an incredibly positive way. There's a little thing that's going to come up on the screen in a moment, I think. I know that you're going to look at it, so I'm just going to sort of speak aimlessly while you read it. I don't like religion, but I love Christians who live out the life of Jesus. And see, this is the good news above all today. This is the light which in fact shines brighter in the darkness. You know, a torch in the middle of the day is not that easy to see. But in the middle of darkness, a torch shines brightly. A life that is filled with love and kindness and compassion points brightly to Jesus. I'm convinced in my mind, convinced in my heart that the institutional sense of the church is dead in our society. But you know what lives? You know what shines bright? Is when the good news of Jesus is shared with a living faith and loving relationships. You know, the Apostle Paul sought to understand the people that he rubbed shoulders with. Can I encourage each one of us to understand, to listen, and see the needs of the people we rub shoulders with? And then to live in such a way that it shines bright. Because we are people of good news. We are people of good news and even better news for a broken and dying world. Let's shine that with a living faith and loving relationships. I'd like to pray for us all. For our God, we thank you that we know that in Jesus we find the ultimate of hope and meaning and love, that it transforms life, that it takes us from slavery to freedom, moves us from guilt to forgiveness, from shame to honour. Our God, we thank you that in Jesus we can find this truth and hope and meaning and love. And God, we pray that for each one of us, it would continue to so transform us that we would live it amongst our world. And our God, I would pray right now for each person here today, that as we leave, go into our homes, go into our social gatherings, go into our workplaces, that we would be people of Jesus, people of love, so they might hear good